The work began before the sun had burned the chill from the mountain air. A steady, rhythmic cleaving of steel through flesh, the sound a wet, percussive counterpoint to the drone of early summer flies. Marta, the quieter of the two, worked the carcasses of deer and elk traded for mended canvas and sharpened tools. Her hands, broad and certain, moved with an economy that belied the brute force required, separating muscle from bone, trimming sinew and fat, laying out long, ruby-dark strips of meat on the slatted wooden racks that covered half their yard. Her sister, Anya, was the architect of this vast undertaking. She moved between the racks, her presence as solid and immovable as the granite peaks that ringed the valley. With a coarse brush, she painted each strip of meat with a brine of salt, crushed juniper, and wild sage. The sun was their accomplice, a relentless engine of preservation. The heat drew the moisture out, shrinking the meat, darkening it to the color of old leather, and concentrating its scent into a rich, smoky perfume that clung to the air for 100 yards. They were 17, but their bodies were forged by labor, thick and powerful, a testament to a life that had offered no softness. When townsfolk passed on the dusty track below their cabin, they would stop and stare. The sisters' yard was an offense against the season's ease, a grotesque display of toil in a time of plenty. The valley was lush, the river ran full, and the coming harvest promised to be the best in a decade. This frantic, obsessive labor was seen as a kind of madness, the grim fixation of two orphans who didn't know how to live without fear. They called them the scavenger sisters, the hoarder twins. The whispers followed them into town, greasy with pity and contempt. They saw two large, strange girls building a fortress of dried meat and withered fruit, and they laughed. Anya and Marta heard the laughter. They felt the stares. But they did not stop. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements synchronized by a silent, shared memory. Beneath the meat racks, trestle tables were laden with sliced apples, wild plums, and foraged berries, all slowly wrinkling and sweetening in the heat, their sugary scent a high, sharp note against the base of the drying meat. The flies buzzed, the sun beat down, and the mountain of winter provisions grew, a visible defiance against the valley's smug and comfortable sleep. The cabin was a legacy from parents they could barely recall, a rough-hewn box of pine logs chinked with mud and moss, smelling perpetually of wood smoke and thyme. It was during the first spring, while replacing a rotted floorboard, that Marta's crowbar had struck not earth, but stone. Together, they had peeled back the floor to reveal a heavy trapdoor with an iron ring. The air that rose to meet them was cold and ancient, a breath from the deep earth. It was a root cellar, dug by their father's father, walled with massive, perfectly fitted river stones and floored with hard-packed clay. It was a tomb of cold, silent air, a promise of preservation. This discovery was the catalyst, the vessel for the terrible foresight that haunted them. Into this sanctuary they carried the fruits of their summer labor. The jerked meat, stiff as wood, was wrapped in precious waxed cloth and laid in long, shallow crates. Dried apples and plums, leathery and sweet, were layered with clean straw in barrels to keep them from sticking. Green beans, shriveled to brittle threads, and sliced squash, curled into hard, orange chips, were sealed in fired clay jars, the lid stoppered with beeswax. It was a library of sustenance, each jar and crate a volume of life catalogued against the coming famine. Down in the town, Mr. Hemlock, the proprietor of the general store, leaned on his counter, his own belly a testament to the valley's prosperity. He saw the sisters pass, their wagon laden with more foraged goods, and chuckled to a customer. "You see that? Wasting the best summer we've had in years. Come winter, they'll be trying to trade that shoe leather for real flour and bacon." Mark my words, the men in the store laughed. They looked at their own full shelves, the barrels of flour, the slabs of salt pork hanging from the rafters. The world was generous. The earth provided. Only a fool, or an orphan touched by grimness, would work so hard to deny the simple, easy pleasures of a fat season. Autumn came, painting the aspens in strokes of brilliant, fleeting gold. The harvest was brought in, the town celebrated, and the sisters' strange, frantic work was forgotten, dismissed as the last, peculiar spasm of a summer fever. They sealed the cellar door, leaving only a small store for their own use in the cabin, and began the endless task of chopping firewood, stacking it in a dense, protective wall against the cabin's northern face. The air grew sharp, and the valley held its breath. The first snow fell not as a gentle dusting, but as a thick, wet blanket that muffled the world overnight. It was beautiful, at first. It clung to the pines and softened the hard edges of the settlement, a clean page laid over the valley. But it did not stop. For a week, it fell, a silent, relentless siege. The sky was a uniform, oppressive white. The world shrank to the distance one could shout. When it finally ceased, the valley was buried. Drifts 20 feet deep choked the pass, sealing it as surely as a mortared wall. The trail to the outside world, their only source of milled flour, sugar, and salt, was gone. For the first month, there was no panic. There were feasts, the slaughter of hoarded pigs, the tapping of cider barrels. The town ate its harvest bounty with a defiant cheerfulness, confident the pass would clear by Christmas. It did not. The cold deepened, settling into the bones of the houses, the bones of the people. The wind scoured the snow into shapes like frozen waves. The sun was a pale, distant disk that offered no warmth. The first sign of real trouble was the smell, or lack of it. The rich sense of baking bread and roasting meat that had defined the town faded, replaced by the thin, acrid smell of burning green wood and, beneath it, the fainter, cloying odor of hunger. The laughter stopped. Doors stayed shut. The skeletons of the sisters' drying racks stood stark against the snow, their purpose no longer mad, but prophetic. From their cabin, higher up the slope, Anya and Marta watched the smoke from the town's chimneys thin and then, one by one, disappear. Their own chimney, however, puffed a steady, confident plume of grey smoke into the frozen air. Inside, their cabin was an island of life in a dead world. The air was warm and thick with the smell of simmering venison stew, the promise of survival made real and savory. They ate their fill, their large frames sustained, their silence not one of fear but of waiting. They had prepared for this. They had built the ark. Now, they waited for the flood to demand its due. The knock on their door, when it finally came, was not a confident rap but a weak, hesitant scratching, like a desperate animal. Anya opened it to find Finn, a boy of 16 whose father had been lost to a logging accident 2 years prior. He stood shivering, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out with a shame so profound it was a physical weight. He could not meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on the floorboards, on the sliver of warm, food-scented air escaping the cabin. He held a small, empty canvas sack in his raw-boned hands. He tried to speak, but his throat was tight with humiliation, and only a dry rasp emerged. Marta appeared behind her sister, a silent, unmoving presence that filled the other half of the doorway. She held no weapon, but her stillness was more intimidating than any threat. Anya looked down at the boy, her expression unreadable. She did not invite him in from the biting cold. She simply waited. Finally, he found his voice, a ragged whisper. "We, my mother and the little ones, we have nothing left. Please." Anything. He held out the sack, a pathetic offering. Anya's eyes did not soften. Her compassion was a thing of structure, of systems, not of sentiment. She had seen what sentiment did to the hungry. It made them weak. It made them wait for a salvation that never came. "We do not give charity," she said. The words were not cruel, just facts laid down like stones. Charity is for the helpless. You are not helpless. Finn flinched as if struck. Despair washed over his face, followed by a flicker of anger. "But we are starving," he pleaded. "There is no work." "There is always work," Anya stated. She gestured with her chin toward the massive wall of firewood. "Our woodpile needs to be moved to the south side of the cabin before the next drift buries it. The path to the creek must be kept clear of ice. A day's labor for a week's rations for your family." She paused, letting the offer settle in the frozen air. "The choice is yours." For a long moment, the boy just stood there, caught between the gnawing emptiness in his belly and the burning shame in his gut. He looked from Anya's implacable face to Marta's silent form, and then at his own trembling hands. To accept was to admit his family's utter failure. To refuse was to condemn them. Slowly, with the weight of a man making a decision that would define him, he let the empty sack fall from his hand. He straightened his shoulders and finally met Anya's gaze. "Where is the axe?" he asked, his voice cracking but clear. More came. First in a trickle, then a flood. A woman with 3 children, her husband sick with lung fever. The blacksmith, his powerful arms gone thin, his forge cold for a month. The seamstress, the tailor, the tanner. Each arrived with the same desperate hope and the same deep shame. Each was met with the same unwavering principle. There was no charity at the sisters' cabin. There was only work. The yard became a strange, silent theater of survival. The townsfolk, who had once mocked the sisters' industry, now bent their own backs in imitation. They moved firewood, cleared snow, repaired the roof, mended tools, sharpened axes. Finn, the first to arrive, became the unofficial foreman, his initial shame burned away and replaced by a fierce, quiet dignity. He organized the crews, his voice steady, his gaze direct. Anya and Marta oversaw it all, moving among the workers, their presence a constant, silent reminder of the pact. They measured out the rations themselves, a portion of jerky, a scoop of dried apples, a handful of withered beans. It was never generous, but it was always enough. It was the taste of life itself. One afternoon, as Anya watched the thin, hungry faces of the people working in her yard, the present dissolved. The cold air was no longer the clean cold of the mountains, but the damp, foul chill of the orphanage cellar where they sent children for punishment. The rhythmic chop of axes became the sound of a gravedigger's shovel hitting frozen earth. She was a child again, small and perpetually hungry, her stomach a tight, aching knot. She remembered Lena, a girl with hair the color of straw and eyes that were too big for her tiny face. In the endless winter of that year, the orphanage rations had dwindled to watery broth and stale bread. Lena had begun to cry at night, a thin, mewling sound of pure misery. Anya and Marta, huddled with her under a single threadbare blanket, had tried to comfort her, offering her their own meager crusts, but it wasn't enough. The crying grew weaker, softer, until one morning it was replaced by an absolute silence. They found her still, a tiny, frozen doll in the grey morning light. The memory was not a thought, but a physical sensation, the feeling of Lena's cold hand, the smell of sickness and despair, the hollow echo in the dormitory where her cries used to be. That night, in the dark, clutching Marta's hand so tightly their bones ached, Anya had made a vow, a whisper of terrible resolve in the face of God's indifference. Never again, she had breathed into the darkness. Not for us. We will never be helpless again. Marta had squeezed her hand back, a silent, binding agreement. The scene in her yard snapped back into focus. The faces were different, but the hunger was the same. She looked at them not with pity but with the grim satisfaction of a promise kept. The news of the sisters' cache eventually reached the last holdout of the old world's logic, a brutish trapper named Gregor who lived with his 2 grown sons in a squalid cabin at the far end of the valley. Gregor's philosophy was simple: the strong take, the weak give. He had survived this long on poached game and by bullying his neighbors for what little they had. When that ran out, he came for the sauce. He and his sons appeared at dusk, 3 hulking silhouettes against the bruised purple snow. They did not knock. Gregor slammed the butt of his rifle against the door. "We know what you have in there," he bellowed, his voice thick with menace. "The whole valley knows. You've had your fill while decent folk starve. We're here for our share." Anya opened the door and stood framed within it, Marta a solid shadow at her back. She did not look at the rifle, she looked at Gregor's eyes. "There is no share to be given," she said, her voice calm and even. "There is only a wage to be earned. There is wood to be chopped." Gregor laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We're not here to work, girl. We're here to take. You and your fat sister have been hoarding. Now it's time to pay." He took a step forward, his sons fanning out behind him, their expressions dull and cruel. He expected fear. He expected the women to collapse, to plead. He did not expect what happened next. From the side of the cabin, Finn emerged from the gloom, holding a heavy splitting axe not like a tool, but like a weapon. He said nothing, simply planting himself between Gregor and the door. Then another figure appeared. Mr. Hemlock, the store owner, his face grim, holding a sharpened shovel. Then the blacksmith, carrying a hammer that could crush a skull as easily as it shaped iron. One by one, they emerged from the twilight, the people of the valley, the men and women who had been working for their lives. They carried axes, shovels, pitchforks, and hammers. They formed a silent, determined semicircle around Gregor and his sons, hemming them in against the cabin. They were no army, just a collection of desperate, hungry people who had found something worth defending. The standoff was absolute. No one spoke. The only sounds were the wind whistling over the snowdrifts and the ragged breathing of Gregor's sons, whose bravado was rapidly evaporating in the face of the silent, armed crowd. They had come to bully two isolated women. They had found a community. Gregor's eyes darted from face to face, seeing not the weak, starving neighbors he had long despised, but a unified front, their expressions hardened by labor and a shared purpose. He saw Finn, no longer a boy but a man, his grip on the axe unwavering. He saw Hemlock, a man he'd always considered soft, now looking as solid and unyielding as a fence post. This was a force he could not break with simple threats. His gaze finally settled back on the sisters in the doorway. Anya had not moved. Her face was a mask of cold resolve. Then, for the first time, Marta stepped forward, moving past her sister onto the porch. She carried the huge splitting maul she used for stubborn logs, its 8-pound head gleaming faintly in the dying light. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. She just held it, its weight resting easily in her powerful hands, a physical statement of the power that resided in this place. The sight of her, combined with the wall of determined townsfolk, broke Gregor's nerve. There would be no easy plunder here. There would only be a bloody, desperate fight, one he was not certain he could win. He spat on the snow, a gesture of impotent rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He backed away slowly, his sons stumbling behind him, their eyes wide with fear. The crowd did not move, did not speak. They simply watched as the three men retreated into the growing darkness, swallowed by the winter they could no longer conquer. When they were gone, a collective breath was released. No one cheered. There was no triumph. There was only the grim, shared understanding of what they had done. They had defended their new world from the old one. Finn turned to Anya, his face illuminated by the light from the cabin. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, unspoken allegiance. Anya nodded back, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. The community, forged in hunger and labor, had held. The winter did not break, but it bent. The siege continued for 2 more months, a long, grinding war of attrition against the cold. But something fundamental had changed in the valley. The sisters' yard was no longer just a worksite, it was the town square, the seat of government, the beating heart of their collective survival. The work shifted from maintenance to preparation. Under the sisters' quiet direction, the men began crafting new tools, repairing wagons, and scouting the lower slopes for the first signs of the thaw. The women gathered in the relative warmth of the cabin, mending clothes, sorting the remaining seeds, and planning the spring gardens, their talk a low, hopeful murmur against the howl of the wind. The hierarchy of the old world had vanished. A man's worth was now measured by the strength of his back and the skill of his hands, not the weight of his purse. Mr. Hemlock, once the most prosperous man in the valley, was now just another laborer, his hands calloused, his pride remade into a quiet competence. He was often seen working alongside Finn, the two of them, the old, humbled merchant and the young, dignified leader, a living symbol of the valley's transformation. The first sign of spring was not a sight, but a sound of the steady, rhythmic drip of melting icicles from the cabin's eaves. Then came the smell of damp earth, a scent so rich and full of life it felt like a miracle. The snow, which had been a pristine, monolithic enemy, grew soft and grey, shrinking away from the tree trunks and south-facing slopes, revealing the bruised and battered ground beneath. A great, collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the people. They had survived. They had endured the crucible and had not been consumed. As the last of the snow melted from the pass, revealing a trail littered with fallen rock and timber, the people looked not to the outside world for salvation, but to each other, and to the 2 silent women on the hill who had shown them the way. The ark had weathered the storm, and its passengers were forever changed. Before the pass was fully cleared, a meeting was called. It was held not in the cold, empty church, but in the open air of the sisters' yard, the ground still soft with meltwater. Everyone was there. Anya and Marta stood on their porch, observing, their role as arbiters now an unspoken fact. It was Mr. Hemlock who spoke first, his voice clear and steady, stripped of its former bluster. He did not offer an apology. An apology was a currency of the old world, a way of wiping a slate clean without changing the arithmetic. Instead, he offered a testimony. I laughed at them, he said, gesturing to the sisters. We all did. We saw their work as madness because we were comfortable. We were fat with an easy season and believed it was our due. We believed the mountain owed us a living. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. We were wrong. We learned that the mountain owes us nothing. We learned that foresight is not madness, it is the highest form of respect for the world we live in. We learned that a community is not a collection of individuals. It is a body, and it starves or thrives together. He then made a proposal. He proposed they build a communal storehouse, a stone barn that would stand as the town's heart, larger and more important than the church or the mercantile. He proposed that 1/10 of every man's harvest, every hunt, every cord of wood, would belong to the storehouse. This would be the valley's tithe, not to a distant god, but to their own shared future. A council would be formed to oversee it, but its guiding principle would be immutable, the one they had all learned through hardship: none who could work would eat for free. Labor would be the only currency for a share. When he finished, a deep silence held the crowd. Then, Finn stepped forward. I agree, he said simply. That was all it took. A murmur of assent rippled through the people, a unanimous vote born not of debate, but of shared, visceral experience. They had lived the principle, and they knew it to be true. The sisters on the porch watched, their faces betraying no emotion, but their work was done. The system they had built out of a private, painful memory was now becoming the covenant of a people. In the years that followed, the story of that winter became a founding legend, a tale told to children by the fire to explain who they were and why they lived the way they did. The communal storehouse was built, its stone walls thick and its cellar deep, a fortress against any future famine. It was the first building a traveler saw upon entering the valley and the last they saw upon leaving. Its presence shaped the landscape and the people. The doctrine they called the sisters' rule became the unwritten constitution of the valley. It governed their economy, their social life, their very sense of self. They became a people apart, known in the wider territories for their fierce independence, their solemnity, and their absolute intolerance for idleness. They were prosperous, but their prosperity was a sober, watchful thing, never taken for granted. The sisters, Anya and Marta, grew old in their cabin on the hill. They never married, never sought a place on the council that governed the rule they had created. They didn't need to. Their authority was woven into the fabric of the place. They remained the valley's silent guardians, their large, stoic figures a constant reminder of the winter that had almost broken them, and the principle that had saved them. They were revered not as saints, but as something more practical and more profound, as prophets of the tangible world, who had understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. The legend never spoke of their motives in emotional terms. It did not speak of pity or kindness. It spoke of their foresight as a kind of power, a grim wisdom born from an unnamed sorrow in their past. It was said that they had seen the face of starvation once before and had sworn an oath to never see it again. The story of what they built became the valley's catechism, a lesson on how individual arrogance could lead to ruin and how collective foresight, earned through shared labor, was the only true salvation. It was the legend of how the memory of one forgotten, starved child in a cold orphanage, a ghost named Lena, had laid the foundation for a new world.